Well, you've been an advisor in Downing Street. It feels like they got the handling of this very, very wrong.
I think that's right. And I think if you spoke to some of the advisors to Boris Johnson, you'd probably hear some contrition. There is, I think, a widespread belief that Downing Street made a mistake, and several cabinet ministers have accepted that. They should not have made the individual case of a specific MP into a broader issue about MP standards, and they should have brought forward the long-term reforms that the government intends to make to the standards regime in an orderly matter that had cross-party support. And I think those were the two mistakes that have led what was ultimately an avoidable crisis to have developed. And the government needs to, I think, quite rapidly get back onto the front foot and start making a case for longer-term reforms to the standards regime.
Will, how do governments tend to make these errors of judgment? Is it that after you've been in power for a fairly long period of time, you start forgetting what is acceptable and not acceptable?
I mean, I think ultimately these mistakes happen quite frequently in parliaments, just some of them rise up the news agenda and others don't. Governments are operating at a pace, often in complex parliamentary environments. They don't know how different MPs are going to vote, and that they rely quite heavily on the whips to kind of give them that intelligence about what's happening within the chamber. The government's also focused on COP26 at the moment, and I suspect that's one of the reasons why balls were dropped. I don't believe it's simply a matter of government being in power too long or the government majority kind of clouding judgment. I think it's much more complex than that, and actually often it's kind of more cock-up than conspiracy, I think. Having worked in Downing Street, that's certainly the case when I was there.
From your experience in Downing Street, when you've annoyed some of your own MPs, which last week's episode clearly has, do you have any advice on how to get those Tory MPs back on side?
Well, I think firstly, Downing Street needs to accept that it's made a mistake. It's done that. And then secondly, I think the government should be open about how the system needs to change in the long run. This isn't just about Owen Paterson. This is about the ways in which MPs behave, the kind of code of ethics and standards that they hold themselves to. And Downing Street should, I think, be the upholder of the highest possible standards. They should get out in front of this, work with the opposition, but also their own backbenchers to make sure that that Parliament is not brought into disrepute and that there is a strong standards regime that can last the test of time.
Which would stop paid consultancy. That's one of the options that are on the table. It sounds sensible enough to me.
So I think we need to differentiate between different types of jobs that MPs do. There are some MPs who are doctors or nurses or lawyers, and I think there is enormous benefit in having those people in the House of Commons. But clearly, if MPs are doing kind of political consultancy, providing policy advice to companies, that's at best providing kind of advice on how to manipulate Parliament to the highest bidder. And I think there is a very good case for preventing MPs from doing that type of consultancy in future.
Please, before we move on to your report, as promised, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, said Boris Johnson should apologise. Should he?
I don't think the Prime Minister himself needs to apologise. I don't think this is necessarily a kind of an error of the Prime Minister's making, but I think the Prime Minister should come to the chamber and explain how he would like the system to change in the long run. I mean, I think ultimately we need to move past what has been not a particularly good or edifying episode towards productive reforms that are going to secure Parliament's kind of reputation in the long run. And I think that is where the Prime Minister does need to kind of be out front and centre in the House of Commons explaining to MPs of all sides.
Just finally, a question on the House of Lords and the appointments made to it, the so-called honour system. Is there anything honourable about those appointments?
Well, we definitely do need to get away from a system which I think we're in danger of embracing, where the House of Lords is seen as a kind of reward for services rendered rather than a recognition of the contribution you could make to the legislative process. I don't think it is a good idea to be appointing people who then go on not to make great contributions to the Lords, or indeed to be making appointments on the basis of how much money people have been given. That said, I would say that lots of the people who were in the newspapers yesterday are people who have very successful careers in business, and so we should be appointing serious business people to the Lords. But it should be on the basis of their contribution to legislation in future, and we should be expecting those people to be speaking in the chamber, amending legislation, improving the legislation before it goes back to the Commons, not really treating it as a kind of bauble to be given to people on the basis of services provided to any particular party or organisation.
Now, the other big story this week is, of course, COP26 and whether we have any hope of keeping the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. A report out today from your think tank, Onwards, finds 2/3 of voters support bold action on climate change, but less than half are happy to pay more to go green. London is the most supportive of net zero, but red wall areas are concerned about the costs. Will, so in terms of the top line from your research, people want more action on climate change. And are they sincere on that desire?
Yes, they are. And this is a new consensus. So 10 years ago, you would not have been able to say that most voters were concerned about climate change or wanted really bold action on the issue. Today, it is a top three issue behind only the NHS and the economy, which is saying something during a pandemic. And there is a very clear desire, as you say, from more than 2/3 of voters for firmer action from the government. And that's true of Conservatives, new Conservative voters who switched to the party in 2019. It's true of red wall areas. There is a kind of broad consensus across the country that we need to go further and faster. But there is, as you say, a nervousness about how that's going to be paid for, and particularly with regard to interventions in people's homes. So things like heat pumps, installation of insulation. People worry a lot about the cost of those interventions particularly.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.